public discourse is saturated with the kinetic, hypersonic missiles, carrier groups, the strategic calculus of a symmetric nation-on-nation war. This is a deliberate misdirection. While analysts debate Russia's readiness for a prolonged NATO conflict, they ignore the central variable: cost. A full-spectrum kinetic war is an economic impossibility for a nation-state already facing a systemic liability crisis. The primary vector of modern strategic conflict is not loud, it is silent. It does not target armies, it targets liquidity. CSIS reports detail the two critical failure points of the global economic OS: the network of subsea data cables and the constellation of orbital satellites. While Poland praises its cyber defenses against attacks on its energy grid, the true asymmetric threat is physical severance. The Royal and French navies are already training with shipborne drones, validating the low-cost, high-impact protocol. For the price of a single fighter jet, an adversary can deploy a fleet of autonomous vectors to sever the data arteries of an entire continent. The result is not a battle. It is an immediate solvency event. Without the constant flow of data, markets evaporate, supply chains halt, command and control is rendered inert. For a nation already suffocating under its own national debt, as documented by economists, this systemic shock is not survivable. It is a checkmate executed without firing a single bullet. This creates the blind Leviathan paradox. A superpower, stripped of its senses, cannot see the attacker, cannot measure the damage, and cannot coordinate a conventional response. It is a giant, thrashing in the dark, aware only of its own imminent collapse. It cannot fight a symmetric war it can no longer afford or control. Mathematically, it is then forced to escalate. Unable to absorb the economic impact or execute a symmetric counterattack, the only protocol left is the one that does not require precise, real-time data. Launch on warning. The silent vector makes nuclear escalation the only fiscally and strategically solvent option to avert total national collapse. The primary driver of the Ukraine conflict is not ideology. It is a solvency crisis. The Russian Federation initiated a war it cannot economically sustain in a symmetric, prolonged format. This is not a strategic miscalculation. It is a mathematical trap. Analysts at CSIS confirm the core liability. A long, unpopular war creates domestic instability that the state budget cannot afford to suppress. The kinetic cost of fielding and losing main battle tanks, aircraft, and personnel against a NATO-supplied adversary creates a systemic drain on the national treasury. This is not war. It's asset liquidation on a national scale. This economic weakness forces a pivot. When you cannot afford a symmetric fight, you are forced to leverage asymmetry. The objective is to inflict maximum economic damage on your adversary for minimal cost. This is the blueprint. We see this doctrine in play. The Royal and French navies are actively training to counter shipborne drones, a direct response to this emerging, low-cost naval threat vector. Simultaneously, Polish authorities foiled a state-backed cyber attack targeting energy infrastructure, another low-cost vector designed to cripple an economy. The math is irrefutable. When a nation is facing a solvency crisis and its low-cost asymmetric attacks are being neutralized, it is cornered. The final lever to avert national bankruptcy and force a conclusion is escalation. The protocol shifts from winning the war to preventing the collapse. This makes the use of non-conventional assets not a choice, but a financial necessity. The core of the equation is the economics of lethality. A strategic analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, blueprints the systemic liability. A modern main battle tank represents a kinetic cost of approximately $5 million. An FPV drone, capable of destroying it, costs $500. This is a 10,000 to 1 cost asymmetry. For every kinetic exchange, the symmetric power hemorrhages capital at a rate that is mathematically unsustainable. This is the democratization of violence. It is not a metaphor, it is an economic principle. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal force has been reduced to consumer electronics level pricing. Any nation-state or non-state actor can now leverage minimal capital to inflict maximal economic damage on a superpower's balance sheet. This forces a nation with significant national debt into a solvency crisis. It can no longer afford to defend itself using conventional symmetric assets. Faced with this blueprint for bankruptcy, a state has only one logical path to avert collapse. It cannot win the war of attrition. It cannot afford the kinetic cost. Therefore, it is forced to escalate to a domain where the cost-exchange ratio is reset. The launch-on-warning protocol for a non-conventional strike becomes a matter of fiscal survival. The math is irrefutable. When a nation's solvency is the primary target, the nuclear option shifts from a last resort to a financial imperative. The primary theater of operations is not where the legacy media directs your attention. It is a distributed network of proxy laboratories, designated gray zones, where the economic and structural tolerance of Western systems is being stress-tested to its breaking point. Recent warnings about systemic decay in nations from South Africa to Canada are not the cause. They are symptoms. They are the controlled demolition sites for a new vector of warfare. Observe the data points. While Royal and French navies train with high-cost shipborne drones in the Mediterranean, this is a reactive posture. The real development, documented by naval intelligence, is the adversary's perfection of low-cost, disposable swarms designed to overwhelm and financially exhaust a capital-intensive fleet. The kinetic cost is asymmetrical. Simultaneously, a foiled cyber attack on Poland's energy infrastructure confirms the blueprint. The objective was not necessarily a blackout, but to force a massive, unfunded expenditure on grid hardening. Each probe forces a disproportionate defensive investment, bleeding the target's treasury without a single shot fired. This is economic attrition, executed through digital vectors. This strategy is lethally effective for one reason: systemic economic liability. As economists like Kurt Couchman have stated, the U.S. national debt is already a critical vulnerability. According to CSIS analysis, a state burdened by unsustainable liabilities cannot fund a prolonged, multi-front, symmetric war. It is mathematically incapable of absorbing the cost of defending against thousands of low-cost asymmetric attacks. The gray zone, therefore, is where the precise dosage of economic poison is calibrated. Reports on Russia's war readiness miss the point. The calculation is not tank for tank, but the cost per intercept versus the national solvency. When the cost to defend exceeds liquidity, the protocol shifts. A nation facing insolvency is forced to escalate towards non-conventional options to avert a national collapse. This isn't a theory, it is a mathematical certainty. The mathematical certainty is that a nation crippled by systemic liability, as documented by Fortune, cannot sustain a symmetric conflict. Analysts at RUSI confirm the exorbitant kinetic cost of modern warfare, a model rendered obsolete by low-cost asymmetric vectors. We have seen the prototypes, the foiled cyber attack on Polish energy infrastructure, and the naval drone exercises detailed by Vocal.media are not isolated events. They are blueprint tests. Therefore, the next phase is not an invasion. It is an economic calculation. A nation-state adversary must test the opponent's solvency threshold before committing to a larger campaign. They must gauge the political will to absorb a multi-billion-dollar shock when the national balance sheet is already fractured. This requires a calibration shot, an attack with maximum economic impact, minimum kinetic cost, and zero attribution certainty. Within the next 12 months, expect a coordinated, multi-point failure of subsea fiber optic cables in the North Atlantic. This will not be a random anchor drag. It will be a synchronized severance of data arteries connecting New York and London. The event will be officially attributed to a cascading equipment malfunction or a unique seismic event. The financial markets will freeze, logistics will seize, and the economic damage will be calculated in the trillions. It is designed to force an impossible choice: absorb a solvency-threatening loss or escalate against a phantom enemy. The response will provide all the data required for the next phase.